Hello, and welcome to another episode of 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones. Today we're going to be talking about Power of Three. Oh, and I'm Rebecca Frema.
And I'm Emily Tesh. Welcome back, everyone. I'm quite excited to talk about Power of Three. I have with me today my own copy, which is not my copy. I stole it from the school library in about 2005, and it's still got all the school library stamps. So I apologise to the librarian who just never got this book back and never will. I'm keeping it.
But hopefully that librarian will listen to this and enjoy it and can get a new, can understand that the loss of the book from the library contributed overall to something more important.
Yeah, this is my first ever book crime, but probably not the last. Sometimes you just need to own a book and it doesn't occur to you to go and buy your own copy.
Whereas I actually didn't have this one in any of the libraries that I had access to growing up. It's one of the very few Diana Wynne Jones books that was written while I was a child that I didn't actually read while I was a child. Which means that I don't have as much of a... When I came back to this one to read it for the podcast, it was very much almost like reading it for the first time because I'd only read it once before, as opposed to almost all her others, which I had read like so many times before that returning to them was just like, oh yeah, I know exactly what's happening here. This one surprised me at almost every turn, and it is a surprising book in a lot of ways.
It is. To me, it feels like two books stuck together, two, maybe three books stuck together. I think this one is what I might call a problem book, as Diana Wynne Jones's go. Not in the way that Wilkins Tooth is a problem book, because Wilkins Tooth only real problem is it's not that good. This is a book that, for me, bites off more than it can chew, doesn't quite come together, but there are some bits that are really, really good and really satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting structure. I think I want to go through the plot maybe in a little more detail than we normally do. Maybe this is just because, again, as I said, the plot surprised me, but also because of the various sort of twists and turns that it takes and the way that the narrative kind of changes and reshapes itself as it goes. Because when this book starts out, it reads much more like a typical fantasy novel than many of Diana Wynne Jones's other works.
Yeah, for the first 90 pages, this is a full secondary world fantasy, vaguely Celtic inspired.
Vaguely Tolkien inspired. I read the first chapter of this book and I was like, oh, we're doing Gollum and we're doing the Ring of Power and then we're flipping it around a little bit.
Yeah, and we're doing cursed family jewelry, which is very Tolkien.
Yes. So the book begins with, and we're told that this is backstory to the main story. That this is a story.
A prologue. This is a proper fantasy book. It's got a prologue.
There's a prologue about a thing that happened in the past that's going to cast a dark shadow over everything to come. In which a child who will eventually grow up to be the mother of our protagonists accompanies her awful brother out on a walk one day, and they come across one of their ancestral enemies, the Dorig, who, as we're first introduced to them, are sort of weird, gray, slimy creatures who live in water. Sound familiar? And this weird, gray, slimy creature that lives in water has a beautiful torque, a collar. I think she uses the word collar and not torque throughout the book.
Yeah, the only people who ever call it a torque are the humans, and they don't turn up till much, much later.
Right. Everyone has torques, and both the kids and the creature that they meet, they all have torques, but the creature's is much, much nicer, and as they immediately assume the creature must have stolen it. And the creature says, no, I got it from my father, the same as you got yours, which I think is important, because this book is significantly about fathers and how the things you get from your fathers resonate on down and cause problems. Anyway, the awful brother, goaded into aggression and feeling a bit like an idiot, says that he wants the torque, and the creature says, you'll take it over my dead body. And then, to the horror of the watching little sister, the brother does. But not before the Dorig has laid an incredibly intense and powerful curse on the collar, a curse that it's going to cause... hang on, I actually have the quote, I think, for the words of the curse. The collar, the words woven in it should figure work against the owner, that power should bring pain, riches loss, truth disaster, and ill luck of all kinds follow and cloud the mind of the possessor. Then it ran its pale fingers along the intricate twists and pattern of the design, bringing each part it touched to bear on the curse, fish for loss by water, animals for loss by land, flowers for death of hope, knots for death of friendship, fruit for failure and barrenness, and each as they were joined in the workmanship to be joined in the life of the owner. At last, touching the owl's head at either end, it laid on them to be guardians, and caused the collar's owner to cling to it and keep it, as if it were the most precious thing he knew.
Right.
And again, I think
It's
that
a
word
heavy
precious,
curse.
that word
Yes.
precious specifically puts us in conversation with Tolkien, I think.
Yeah, I think this one is both talking to Tolkien and talking to, of course, Tolkien didn't come up with cursed jewelry,
Right.
or like curses rebounding on the owners by himself. Like, he's drawing on a wide range of medieval sources, and Diana Wynne-Jones is also an Oxford-educated medievalist, and in this book and in Dalemark, you occasionally get the impression that she would like you to know it.
Yes, she definitely would. She's, and as she always does with stories, she's playing with them, and eventually she's going to bring them down and up into the present day of our story time. That's a thing that she will always do, sort of more or less by the end or the middle of the book. But we start really firmly in the realm of the epic, in the realm of the saga, and the sort of preset tragedy that's going to echo on down the line.
Right. And there's specifically the power of 3 in the title. Orban, the awful brother, says, well, it's only going to be a weak curse, I'm not scared. And then he attacks, and this Dorig, who he is facing, says, I will call upon the great powers, the old power, the middle power, and the new power, to enforce this curse. And that gives it its real strength, and then Orban kills him anyway, and it becomes a dying curse.
It becomes a dying curse. And afterwards, his horrified sister, who's now, her illusions about her brother are shattered, she's come to see him, and indeed her whole family, as potential murderers rather than heroes. And she's haunted by this, and she goes back and she swears to her brother never to tell what happened, but she tells her grief to the stones. And while she's telling her grief to the stones, the Dorig's brother pops up and says, I've heard you, and now I know what happened. And then, in response to this, both of them go on to swear their own oaths. Adara, who is the sister, swears to lift the curse, and the brother says, thanks, you can swear to lift the curse if you want. I swear to revenge my brother by helping the curse in every way I can. I shall spill every drop of Orban, the brother's blood, except yours, and dedicate it to the powers. I call on them not to be placated until none of Orban's people are left alive on the moor. May the hidden stones bear witness, and the sun, moon, and earth.
Right, so if we're talking Tolkien inspiration, or medieval inspiration, we've now got not just cursed jewelry, but also the family oath to pursue the curse to the ends of the world, which is straight out of the Silmarillion, except the Silmarillion wasn't published yet. So actually, right. I think it's picked from the same sources.
Yes. And we're also in the realm of sort of, in addition to all this, I think we're also talking to sort of the classic Welsh fantasy of the 60s and 70s. It's significant that the collar, the torque, has on the ends of it owls, and that we're talking about like hereditary curses laid on a valley. I think that harkens a little bit back to Garner's Owl Service, which was published a couple of years before this. And, you know, repeated patterns in what you do about them is also a theme that's sort of in the air in children's fantasy at this time.
Yeah.
But what I think is really interesting about these curses and these oaths is that we're given all of them in the first chapter. It makes it seem like a bunch of really, really awful things are about to happen and resonate down.
Right. There's like this huge tragedy being set up. And it doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. None of these curses are ever fulfilled.
I was just looking at the wording just now as you were reading it out, and I was like, well, technically, by the end of this book, none of Orban's people will be left alive on the moor, except Adara. That is completely true. Right. And there are various horrible things that happen to the owner of the curse. It just ends up mostly not being Orban. And in fact, it happens to a very minor character off screen for most of the book.
Right, and it also ends up mostly not being relevant. Like, you're given I spent this whole book, you know, for the first half of it, being like, when are they going to have to try and get the collar away from somebody who won't want to give it up? This is going to be major. No, mostly the collar just get passed around by people who are like, oh, that's a bad thing, and I don't want my spouse or my father or whatever to have it, so I'm going to move it off somewhere else off page. It turns up in all kinds of places with just sort of the interstitials lightly filled in.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because actually it is Jones sort of applying her some very logical mind to the spell casting, the magic wording. It not only says the owner is going to try and cling to it like it's his
Right.
precious, but the owner's wife can be like, that thing is shit, I'm getting rid of it.
Right, exactly.
Or like some kid who walks into the owner's house and finds it in a drawer can be like, well, that looks bad.
Right. Let's give it back where it came from,
But
please.
right, this
Now.
idea that there are actually other people in the story. There are always other people around, like the central figures of the story. So this seems like it being set up to be the great tragedy of Auburn and Adara, but in fact, both of them are minor characters in someone else's story.
Right. And there are lots of other people in the story. And when we get so in fact, the book is actually set up. The first line in the book is, "This is the story of the children of Adara, of Amy and Carrie, who both had gifts, and of Gare, who thought he was ordinary." Now, I also don't think that's true. I don't think it is the story of the children of Adara. I think it's the story of Gare, and Gare has some siblings, and they're relevant in the story. But really, it's the story of another set of three. It's Gare and the other kids from other cultures that he meets on the moor. But we do spend several chapters like it's going to be the story of Gare and of the children of Adara. We're introduced to these three kids. The oldest sister, Aina, who has the power of foresight. When she's asked questions, she will answer them correctly. As long as she's asked the right questions, this gives you can find out the future from her.
Right, there's a whole lot in this book about finding out the future, about destiny. So the curse is the destiny of Auburn's family, or of whoever holds the cursed collar. And then there's Aina's gift of the sight asked, where if you ask her what's going to happen, that is what's going to happen. And eventually it will transpire that Gare, who thought he was ordinary, also has a gift of prophecy. It's the gift of sight unasked, where he knows what's going to happen without knowing how he knows.
Which mostly just manifests itself as bad feelings, bad vibes.
Yeah, tremendously bad vibes. What all these things do, of course, is they set up a tension that runs through the book of what's going to happen, how is this curse going to play out, have we asked Aina the right questions, what does Gare's bad feeling mean?
Right, and then there's another plot point that's sent to play early on with the youngest sibling, Carrie, who has two gifts. One, he has a fairly ordinary gift, which is he can find lost objects. If you ask him where anything is, he knows where it is. And the second is that he has the much more vague and ambiguous power of thought. He can change the properties of things with his mind. And quite early on, we're told that he's not really old enough or responsible enough to have this particular power, and he's very afraid of what's going to happen with it and what he might do with it. Again, none of that ever really happens. He's pretty much fine with the power.
Yeah, this is... Okay, so we were talking about Let's Explain the plot of this book, and we kind of immediately started diving into... the first 90 pages of this book is a different book.
Yes.
And a really interesting one, and a really awful one. I think it's a full tragic adult fantasy in which a lot of bad things happen.
Right.
But at about this 90-page mark, we get a flip of point of view, a flip of the whole concept of the book, which makes you go, oh, nothing here is what I thought it was.
Right.
And it brings me to something I think Diana Wynne Jones is brilliant at, something that is, like, if you like, one of her real strengths as a writer is her control of point of view. She is very much a character-first writer, and that's become increasingly clear, just like as we go through the 70s and she digs more and more into point-of-view characters. She's interested in what any given person knows and how that controls their understanding of the world. And of course, when you're reading a book, you, the reader, only know what the book tells you.
Right.
And the point-of-view character in a Diana Wynne Jones book will only tell you what they know.
Yes. And sometimes...
And in Power of Three, we do skip out sometimes into other points of view, but we are mostly in Gare's head, and we know what Gare knows. And Gare does not know a lot of things.
Yes, and one of the things that Gare does not know is that the third species that lives on the moor, so we've got people, they're only ever called people when we're in Gare's point of view, which is we are for much of the book. And we've got Dorig, who, as far as we know, are weird and silvery and maybe cold-blooded and live in water. And then we've got giants, who are very large and thunder around, and dangerous, and thunder around somewhere just out of frame.
Right, and Gare understands that the other two species have weird magical powers. So the Dory can shapeshift, and the giants have powerful magical artifacts that work by themselves.
Yes.
And sometimes the giants go to war with each other, and you can hear the strange rumblings and groanings of the earth as they wreak terrible destruction.
Yes.
And you're like, yeah, that sounds like giants.
Yeah, absolutely.
And eventually, at this sort of 90-page mark, maybe a third of the way into the book, Gare decides, after a fight with his father, who he has a complicated relationship with, to go and find a giant.
And he does.
He goes and finds a giant.
He finds a giant. He finds two giants. The giants' names are Gerald and Brenda, and they're having a fight over a boombox.
Right. So Gare is like standing behind a tree watching, and he's like, this giantess has a magic box that sings, but it doesn't sing very well. Or rather, it doesn't seem to understand what's going on, because it's singing about love, but they're having a great big fight.
And immediately it recontextualizes the whole book, and you understand that our POV characters have been living alongside human beings and are hidden from human beings and are perhaps what we might call elves. Or when Gerald and Brenda actually meet them first properly, they're like, oh, you're fairies. And our kids are very offended. They're like, we're absolutely not fairies. Fairies are stupid little things with wings. We are people. I don't know what you are. You're giants.
They also say, like, fairies aren't true.
Right.
And then Gerald and Brenda say, well, no, giants aren't true. We're people, you're fairies. And there's an ongoing argument about who gets to be people, or who thinks they're people, and what you other people are if you're not people.
Right. And there's also something really interesting about perspective, specifically as it allows the kids to relate to each other. So when we first are introduced to the concept of giants, it's Gare seeing a giant's foot, and it seems to him huge, unfathomably enormous. And when he actually sees Gerald and Brenda interacting with each other the same way that he and his siblings might interact, Gerald and Brenda are not siblings, they're neighbor kids who hate each other, but they have a very siblingish vibe. Except when they start getting into fights about, who's been in the valley longer and who's lording it over whom. But when he starts actually looking at them as people, he realizes that they are approximately his own height. They're not actually that much taller. They're larger and stockier, and they sort of move on the earth differently. They shake the ground. The environment reacts to them in ways that it doesn't react to people, the children of the sun. But they're, like, in terms of actual, like, physical height, they're not that distinct. And similarly, later in the book, Gerald and Brenda go looking for Gare's home. They're trying to pass a message to Adara, to their mother. And at first when they see it, it looks to them like a rabbit warren. It's small. It's not a place that people could live. And then when they say the right words and look at it properly, they're like, oh, this is a huge house. There's a door. I can walk through it. It's like, right. It's never sort of explained why this happens, why there are these shifts of perspective, literally in the book, in terms of what size they are and how they relate to each other. But it does seem to be that when they start interacting with and thinking of each other as people, they literally they're able to see each other at their right height and not at these huge, distinct, distances.
Right. It's almost as if there's a distortion in each, like, people's minds about what the others are like, which is preventing them actually seeing what they are. And it's revealed sort of quite late in the story. The Dory, two Dory teenagers come out of the water to negotiate with Gare and the others, and with Gerald and Brenda, and they take off their wetsuits. Mm-hmm. And they take off their wetsuits, and they're just people. And you're like, oh, so the whole horrible, grey, slimy, yeah, if you live underwater, you need a wetsuit.
Right. And it's also, like, it's significant for them, for the Dorig, that unhooding and showing your actual face, your more or less human face, to a stranger is significant. It shows a sign of trust. It shows that you can interact with that person. We're not explained this. We just get this because Gare doesn't know it. We just get this through bits and pieces of overhearing the Dorig talking about who's unhooding to whom and saying, well, I didn't unhood to them. So it's either, I didn't unhood to this person and therefore we don't have a relationship. We don't owe each other anything. Or I did unhood to this person and therefore I do owe them something. I owe them good treatment. I owe them the ability to negotiate.
Yeah, that's not the only sort of ritual or friendship that exists in the book, because the other one is about exchange of collars. Yes. We're back to the collars again. So there's a whole sequence of exchanges, not just of the cursed collar, but of the children's own personal collars. They swap around with each other, they give to each other. In the previous generation, Gare's father has actually done a fairly complex collar swapping situation, which puts him in guest friendship, collar friendship
Right.
relationships with people of both the giants and the Dory. And we also have, I think, there's a whole sequence where Gare and Kerry and Aina go to visit the giant's house, and they are taken inside and given tea and biscuits and bacon.
Yes.
And there's quite a funny place of them like being amazed and astonished by the marvelous magical miracles the giants have in their kitchens, such as the box that makes warm but no fire. But there's also like a hospitality ritual happening here, right? The giants don't explicitly acknowledge it as such, but the children seem to understand it that way, that look, we've eaten together, we've spoken together, we have a bond now. And then Gare responds by giving Gerald his collar.
Right. And I would argue that I think the thing that really kicks off the book and the actual power of three in the title, I mean, the power of three can refer to many people over and over and over again. That is the usefulness of this rather vague title. But the first thing that really changes the direction of this book is when Gare looks at Gerald and has a flash of recognition. There's something about Gerald that Gare connects with. When they, at first, when they come out and they see Gare and Gerald get in a raging fight, and Gerald and Brenda get in a raging fight, and Aina immediately is on the side of Brenda. She's like, "Oh, Gerald, this other giant is clearly horrible. He's just like our bully cousin." And meanwhile, Carrie, the youngest son, says, "No, actually, I think he's a bit like Gare." And Gare is at first really troubled by this. He's like, "Why is this angry giant like me?" And then he looks longer at this giant, and he's like, "Oh, he is like me." So the first thing he says is he saw a fierce, moody nature, unhappy deep down and unhappy too on the surface. And then he goes back alone to creepily watch Gerald again.
There is a whole lot, actually, of boys creepily watching each other and thinking about how similar they are and how much they would understand each other if they talked to each other.
Right. Gerald strode about, crushing grass and shaking the earth, his dark face set in a lonely, private look which Gare found very familiar. It was not the bully's look. Gare knew it was his own. The giant did not look happy. Gare wondered why. He wondered, too, if he looked that unhappy himself. And obviously he does, because his siblings look directly at Gare and at Gerald are like, "Oh, you guys are basically the same."
Right. And then there's actually a third part of this like creepy staring trio, which is the whole time Gare is hanging out in the woods staring at Gerald. He's also going like, "What is that bird doing there?" And the bird is a shape-shifting Dory, Hafni, who is the son of the brother who swore this great oath to destroy all Orban's people. And he is watching Gare while Gare watches Gerald. And they have this sort of three-way connection of we are in some way similar. And Gerald's the only one who doesn't know that anything's going on.
Right. But Gerald also, I think, we're in Gerald's head much less than we're in Gare's. But the moments that we're in Gerald's head are always when it's after the collar exchange. Gare gives Gerald his collar, and first it's just as a sign. He says, "I'm going to give you my collar so you can go talk to my mother, and she'll know that you're not attacking, that I've given this to you in friendship." And then he says, "Actually, I want to do this meaningful collar exchange. I'm giving it to you properly. I'm saying the words of friendship." And whenever we're in Gerald's head, it's because he's thinking about how much this collar exchange means to him, how he's never been so touched and honored by a gift in his whole life, that it means something, this point of connection that he's not had. And later on, towards the end, when Gare and Gerald go on a small quest with the Dorig, who's also the who's the one who's been watching them, Gare almost drowns, and Gare thought that it was just his luck that the only two people who had ever, as far as he knew, spontaneously liked him should be a giant and a Dorig. They've got a sad teen boy connection that transcends racism.
And that brings me to, I think, one of the points of failure of this book. This book is encouraging you, I think, to read it metaphorically, allegorically. This is a book about three different peoples who see each other as totally alien until their children are able to find these points of connection and say, actually, we're not so different, are we? We're all just people, really. Why don't we all get along?
Literally, she says, "Have you noticed that we're all people, really?" says Gare. And everyone's like, "Oh, wow, that's true."
That's so deep. I mean, of course, they are different species. They seem to be different species, but similar, connected species. But right, it's a very obvious, very naked metaphor for race relations, for specifically, I think, for post-colonial race relations. Because one of the
Yeah.
arguments about it is who has the right to live here on the moor.
Right.
And Gers instinctively feeling, well, it's me, it's us. This is my moor.
Right.
This is where I live. And then you have a later argument with the Dori who say, sorry, I've been pronouncing it Dori because I think that's probably
I
the
think
correct
you're probably
pronunciation.
right. You
But
are the person.
I might be wrong. It's just that the character Brenda, whenever she says it, gets it slightly wrong and is spelled wrong in a way. I think it's a hint.
Yes, you're probably right. I trust your pronunciations of all of these names much more than I trust
I'm
mine.
a complete nerd. Anyway, they talked to Dory about it and said, Dory said, we were here first. You chased us out. We used to live on land until you chased us into the water. And then the Gare says, no, we were here first. And the giants made us go and live in the hills. And then at this point, the giants turn on each other. And Brenda says, we were here first. Gerald Masterfield, that's his surname, because he's a fucking Norman landowner or a descendant of one. His family has been in the region for 900 years, owning the land. He's like, this is my wood. And he does clearly have a sense of strong personal possession and connection to this wood in the same way that earlier in the story, Gare, has a particular windowsill where he goes to sit and think, and it's his windowsill. Gerald feels that way about the wood.
Right, Gerald's much bigger. Gare understands this perfectly. He's like, Gerald's much bigger, so he needs a whole wood. If I was the size of a giant, I probably would need a whole wood too.
And this is, these kids are attempting to negotiate like a fair settlement between them all, but this is the point where Gerald completely loses his temper. Like, if 900 years isn't enough, what is?
Right. And I think that, I do think that it's as metaphor, it's bad and doesn't really work. So one of the things that I think that she is quite smart to do, at least, is that it's always set in context of these same fights about who's here first, who has the right to live here, whose space are we on, whose place is this, are always echoed among the different sort of groups as well as in between them. So I think the first moment that we really get this is when one of the sort of inciting incidents of this book is when the Gare's awful uncle and his awful cousin, the evil uncle, the murdering uncle, and his entire family, they get kicked. Basically, they have a battle with the Dorig. They're kicked out of their mound, their hill where they live, and they come and knock on their family's door, on Gare's door, and says, we need a place to live. Can you let us in? And of course, the Gare's father, the hero, and his mother, the notorious wise woman, say, of course you can come and stay here. What else can we say? And then immediately there starts to be tension because the house is too small, the hall is too small, and there's not enough space for these two groups. And everyone immediately starts feeling crowded and like the other people are doing things exactly in a way such as that's designed to inconvenience the others. You're building your house and setting up your looms exactly where they're going to get the light in the way of my light, and so on. And it's, it's a refugee situation, but it's also setting up a tension about who has the right to live in this space and who has the right to the resources of this space internally before we even get to, now we're having arguments with the giants and the Dorig about the rights and resources.
And it turns out that there's a similar sort of refugee situation among the Dori in that there is another set of halls elsewhere that have been flooded out, and there are thousands of Dori living in this very overcrowded underwater hall, desperate for more space. We have Brenda and Gerald's argument, but actually the giant argument about who has the right to use this space takes it right out of this context of the moor and into contemporary Britain. And we discover that the moor is actually under threat from an external force, which is the civil service water division. Because the plan is to flood it and turn it into a reservoir to secure drinking water for the City of London. And if the moor is flooded, everyone is screwed at this point. Even the Dori will not be able to stay because there is magic in Gare's family mound, on their wells, which makes the water unsafe for Dori, and if those wells overflow and mix with all the water in the reservoir, Dori can't stay, which is part of why they declare war against Gare's people.
Yes.
if the hills are underwater, then the people in the hills can't stay, Guest people can't stay, and of course, if the whole moor is flooded, then the humans living there can't stay.
Right. And there's a whole conversation that they have with this, because one of the things that happen, one of the ways they try and resolve this at the midpoint of the book is Gerald's father has invited an old friend turned enemy of his, who is now the person who has made the decision to flood the moor, to come have dinner and stay with them and see if they can rekindle their friendship and talk him out of flooding the moor. Which at first it seems impossible, because it turns out that the way they fell out years ago was about the cursed collar.
Yes. So the backstory is revealed that these two men, the night before Gerald's father married Gerald's mother, found themselves mixed up in a hero story with a weird little guy whom they call Titch, and whom Gare instantly recognizes as his own father.
Yeah, it's so, again, this is probably, I think, the closest that she gets in this book to her normal, like, to the way that she often does this move of story time to putting to present day time, to, you know, how the heroes move among us. So we've got to talk about the father issues in this book.
We've got to talk about guests.
Because it underlies the whole thing. But early on, we are told that Gare's father, Guest, is a great hero. He won his mother, Adara, by performing 3 heroic tasks for her. He answered a bunch of riddles, which is weird because we know Guest doesn't know anything about riddles. He's bad at them. He got a beautiful collar from Adorig, and he moved an enormous stone that's too big for anybody to move. And the way he did these tasks is a great mystery, but everyone now acknowledges him as a hero. And then we hear it from the other side, from the Bachelor Night adventure of, you know, it was the night before Gerald's father's wedding, and they stole a tractor and went on kind of a drunken rampage around the moor because a weird little guy was like, hey, wouldn't it be fun to move that stone?
Right. So there is, like, Guest's hero tale. Gare, throughout the story, feels like a letdown to his father because he feels like he's ordinary next to his father, the hero. And then he finds out that what his father actually did was he got his future wife to tell him the answers to the riddles, to get the collar of Adori, which had seemed like this huge, like, difficult and impossible task. All he did was go and, like, make friends with one.
Yep.
They swapped.
And you don't ever really get why the Dorig did this, agreed to do this. It seems that he just sort of thought it was funny, even though he's sworn. This is the same one who's sworn to, you know, rid the moor of these terrible liemen.
I think it's implied that it's because Guest wants to marry Adara. And Adara is, like, the one good one.
Right. He's like, well, I guess you have good taste and you seem not terrible, so sure. But specifically, we're told that even though Gare says the words over his collar and sort of swears Guest friendship to him, the Dorig doesn't do so in response. He said, I didn't say words over my collar and I didn't unhood to him, but I did give him the collar.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, Guest to finish, it's really confusing that all the names begin with G.
I know.
Guest to finish his, like, hero conventions does, in fact, just go on this Bachelor Night rampage with the tractor.
Right.
And the hero story is reframed as, like, a comedy anecdote from our youth.
Yeah. It's actually, there's kind of a fun line here where, you know, at first Jerry and George are fully ready to go on the Bachelor Night rampage, and then they get a little more sober, and they're like, we're gonna get in so much trouble if we do this. And Titch says, he looks, and they say, you know, Titch has said, oh, I'll give you something, a nice gold collar if you'll do this for me.
He puts his hands to his neck, and then realizes he's already given his collar to someone else. He's like, I'll go and get you one.
Right. And Jerry and George are like, well, let's see this collar then. If we're going to do this thing, I bet you're just having us on. And it says, Titch seemed both dismayed and exasperated, but he seemed faintly amused too, as if Jerry and George were behaving according to some absurd pattern, which is, I think, even though every time Gare is accused of being a fairy or an elf, he's like, no, absolutely not. That's absurd. I think is one of the clearest clues that we have that Gare's people are, in fact, what we would think of as elves in sort of British mythology.
Right. And what ends up happening is Guest goes back to Adara to get the collar he just got from the Dory. But in the dark, a different woman, Castor, who we haven't mentioned till now, but she is the wife of the awful brother Orban.
She's the awful aunt. There's going to be, you know, one of Diana Wynne Jones' classic awful aunts.
Right, yeah, you can't have Diana Wynne Jones, but a horrible older woman. Well, she passes the cursed collar to Guest instead to give the giants. And actually, if I were her, I would have done the same, because it's clear that at this point in her life, the cursed collar is like has caused quite a lot of shame and horror for her. It's given her an unhappy marriage and multiple miscarriages. Like, all this stuff is sort of mentioned in passing off screen. It's not important to the children, so the workings of the curse don't have the full tragic horror that we might have expected from the prologue.
Right. I want to get back, to. Well, I'm putting a pin in this because I do want to get back to how, Casta figures out completely off screen that the color is cursed. This is never a plot point. It's never relevant. There's a lot of stuff about women doing things in this book just off screen, or figuring things out, or having connections, that's really irrelevant to Gare, and he doesn't think about it at all, but it's all in the interstitials.
Point of view control. That's the Diana Wynne-Jones thing. We are stuck with the point of view of these children, and especially of Gare, and we know what they know, and they are not thinking about the grown-ups as people most of the time.
Right.
And in fact, it's that reframing of his father for Gare from guess the hero who I can't live up to guess the guy manipulating two drunk idiots on a night out. It's heartbreaking for him. It undoes him. It makes him furious and angry and bitter, and it actually leads to him making some very bad choices to deciding to go on this final quest, which he realizes later is actually the curse taking hold of him.
Right. And this is also the connection that he has, the instant connection, the instant recognition that he has to Gerald. We're not told really anything about Gerald's relationship to his father, but we accept through what Gare recognizes, and a point, towards the end of the book, when they're in prison together and Gare is thinking miserably about how he's led Gerald to his death. And Gerald, meanwhile, carefully puts Gare's collar to his neck and says, I say, do you find you get on with your father? Like, he has recognized this point as well as the thing that brings them together. And we know that the collar has ruined Gerald's life, again, from these things that we learn in passing. His mother is dead, his sister is dead, and he doesn't get on.
His house is about to be flooded.
Yes, his house is about to be flooded, and whatever his relationship with his father is has clearly been really strongly warped by the influence of the collar. And that brings Gare and Gerald and eventually Hafni all together, is their fathers are sort of under the influence of powers that make their sons misunderstand them, that make them misunderstand their sons. Yeah. I think Gare even says at one point, he's thinking about this connection that he has to Gerald, and he's like, he's the only person I felt like I've connected with this in this way, because everybody else gets along with their fathers. There's another kid in the mound who I really like and could have been friends with, but I didn't understand how he seemed to get on so well with his father, and so we could not connect. Right.
And part of the heroic resolution of the story is Guest declaring his pride in Gare. Guest finally announcing to the world at large, although not to Gare personally, that he loves Gare and admires him and respects him, is sort of presented as part of a happy ending. Should we talk about the ending? I feel like every episode of this, we get to a point where we're like, we got to do the ending. And it's Diana Wynne-Jones climax, so it's weird.
Right, we've got to do the ending, but I want to roll back a little bit first. The reason that I started talking about the scene with Gerald and George, the bachelor party night is all, is I wanted to jump back to a conversation that they have with, I forget which father, whether it's his father that's Jerry and the other one is George.
No, the father is Jerry because the father is Gerald Senior. It's Gerald Senior, Gerald
Right.
Senior. This was confusing me as well. Like, why are all the giants just names?
It's everybody. But they have an argument about why they're like, well, you can't flood the moor. You're gonna have to move people away. And it's George Claybury.
Right. The civil servant is called George Claybury, and he's mostly known as Mr. Claybury through the book.
Right. And Gare wants to explain about his people and how they're going to be flooded out. But in order to do that, he'd have to explain about the evil collar, and that would mean explaining also that his father had, perhaps knowingly, given an extremely evil thing to two harmless giants. And in the face of all those other giants and their huge thirst, he just could not bring himself to do it. So instead what he says is, but why should a few people suffer a lot, he said, so that a lot of people shouldn't suffer at all? Couldn't they all use less water, Ana suggested? Mr. Claybury smiled and shook his head. Only as a last resort. This is a very old argument. The greatest happiness of the greatest number. If you think about it, you'll find it always works out that a few suffer for the good of the rest. In stories, Gare agreed hopelessly, brave men die defending the rest, but this isn't like that. So they're having this argument about who needs to sacrifice for whom and whose good counts and, what do we count as the good of the many?
And of course, I mean, put this a little bit in context. There are several drowned villages under reservoirs around
Yes.
the UK, some of them very ancient. There's a couple under the Lady Bower Reservoir in Yorkshire, but I think the one that Jones must have had in mind leading up to writing this book was it's the one that's drowned quite late in the 1960s, Capel Celyn, which was
Yeah.
a Welsh village, a village in North Wales, in a valley, quite a small village. I think there were 12 houses, not many people. One of the last fully Welsh speaking settlements in the country, and the story of the near death and resurrection of the Welsh language with aggressive lack of help and sometimes aggressive hostility from the English government is a story that I think matters hugely.
Yeah, that's one of
Um,
the other reasons that I want to put this, that I think it's worth putting this into context with the Welsh fantasy of the 60s and 70s, because I do think that there's something here. Diana Wynne Jones, I think, as we said on earlier episodes, comes from a Welsh family. Her grandfather is a Welsh preacher who preaches in Welsh, very sort of, she writes about how sitting in church and listening to him preach sort of rollingly and intimidatingly.
Right. And she has this sort of memory of as a child, like visiting her Welsh family in this little in a village and not being able to play with the other children because she didn't speak their language. So the little
Yeah.
English girl in the Welsh village. And we talked about that a bit in the context of Delmark and divided identity.
Yeah, and I
But
do think that there's an element of wish fulfillment here almost in the fact that all of these three people speak the same language.
yeah,
So when they're trying to talk things out, it's the power of words and the power of speech that I think we're going to have to come back to and talk a little bit about that. That's really significant to the magic of this book. But it's all mutually intelligible. There's no language barrier once they actually start talking to each other.
yes. But to bring it back to the fate of Capel Celyn, so
Yes.
this Welsh village, they found out in the 1950s that this valley had been selected for flooding. It was agreed by an Act of Parliament, which meant that there was no opportunity to protest. It took sort of 10 years, during which the inhabitants of the village sort of begged anywhere and everywhere they could. The purpose of the reservoir was to provide drinking water for the city of Liverpool. It failed. Short answer. Capel Celyn was drowned in, I think, 1966, 67, and remains underwater to this day, and the village was scattered, the community was broken. So this is a story of injustice, right? A
Yes,
story of
absolutely.
like, at the time this book was written in the 70s, a very contemporary injustice.
Right.
Um, a native people, an earlier people, a people speaking their own language with their own culture, being flooded out of their homes for the benefit of the greater number.
Yes, and she's removed it. Like, this book does not, to be clear, it does not explicitly. It's not set in Wales. The
No.
book For British Fantasists by Charles Butler identifies the moor that this is based on as Otmore, which I think is
that's got to
which
be
is
right, because Otmore is in Oxfordshire, and Diana Winch has a very close connection to Oxfordshire and talks like very movingly about the landscape of Oxford and surrounding environs in her essays. Otmore is also a wetland, which is important for this like three people, some of them living underwater. And Otmore has been since the 1920s the home of a bombing range, firing range for the military. And there's this whole like throwaway sequence early on where they're like, the giants have gone to war. We can hear the thundering of their weapons. And you go, what?
yeah.
Because where in the British Isles? It's a bombing range. The giants are in fact practicing going to war.
Uh-huh. And the syllable "ot" shows up multiple times. Not
Yes,
aside from all the G names, the horrible uncle's family is there's a lot of "ot" and "o" names sort of
And they
scattered
and
in
they
that
and they
lineage.
live in a place that they call Ott Mound. So
Yes.
Ott Mound, which they say is the oldest of the mounds on the moor. So Ott Mound, the capital of Otmore. So yeah,
So
I
this
think
is
that identification is correct, and it's imagining what if this Oxfordshire valley was given the treatment of. Well, it's not just Capel Celyn, because there are other drowned villages. I think it's Althorpe under Lady Bower Reservoir. The clock tower was standing until the 1940s, and then they decided it was a hazard and blew it up. But until then, you can see the tower of the old church like poking up above the water.
Yeah. Very, very haunted. But yeah, so they have this argument about the greater good and whether they really need to flood people out of this reservoir. And uh, George, I keep forgetting his last name. The civil servant
Slavery.
Clavery makes the argument about sacrifice and about the need for sacrifice and the sacrifice of the few to save the many. And then we get to the ending.
Right, which is all about sacrifices. So, after all this fuss, Gare decides the only thing to do is to somehow try and undo the curse on the collar. And his idea is that he and Gerald, as like representatives of the other two peoples, will go to the king of the Dorig, who is, his name is Hathil. This is the younger brother who swore vengeance for the murder at the very start of the book. He is now the king. He is the father of Hafni, who is this Doric prince who has also tried to join this like connection of the children all negotiating with each other, these sort of groups of three. So Hafni will take them down to visit his father as messengers, to bring back the cursed talk and see if they can all agree something. It's a terrible plan.
Yes.
So what Death's doing is handing himself and Gerald over into the hands of a hostile power who has sworn destruction on them all.
It doesn't work. The king of the Dorig immediately is like, great, what would you do to take the curse off? Everything? Anything? Wonderful. You're willing sacrifices, and we're going to sacrifice you to the old powers, and that will get rid of the curse and fix everything for everybody.
Right,
and
so
then
the three powers that like guarantee the curse, and I think it is clear that there are three magical powers at work behind everything that's happening, behind all these trios. It's like a myth behind the myth,
yes,
which is that they have different names for in the different cultures. The old, the middle, and the new power, and then they're the power of the moon, the power of the sun, the power of the earth.
Right, and
we never get told the giant names for them, but I'm going to talk about that because I think we can actually work out what the giants would say.
Yeah.
But the idea is that the powers need appeasing, and the only way to appease them is human sacrifice.
And they already did it once. They're like, we've already appeased one of the powers, which was just by moving the big rock, which is on top of the drunken bachelor party exchange, which is on top of a burial mound, and they freed the trapped spirits. Now, we don't know anything about the trapped spirits. This is a throwaway multiple times. Like, it gets casually referenced to until we get the end. They're like, oh yeah, that appeased one of the powers because we freed a bunch of trapped ghosts.
I honestly think even Jones feels this is a bit of a cheat, because actually there's a secondary level of appeasement for the old power, where Hafni, realising that what he's done is take Gerald and Gare to their deaths at his father's hands, goes and hands himself over to Gare's people, expecting to be killed in return. So a kind of like eye for an eye, a mutual vengeance. And that willing self-sacrifice, that's an actual willing sacrifice.
Yes.
That's Hafni expecting to die and doing it anyway. That appeases one of the three powers. The old power, the power of the moon, which is associated with the Dori. And it's suggested that like the Dori have a particular personal understanding of this power, of how it works, and that Hafni has instinctively, intuitively done exactly the right thing. But there are still two powers left in the curse.
Right, and so the Dori are like, right, we're going to sacrifice Gare and Gerald, and that's going to do it. And then the whole, I do want to come back and talk about some of the ways in which the plot comes about, because it involves a teen girl trio that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
But to get to sort of the mythic ending, so Jerry and George and Guest and Adara and all of the kids turn up to renegotiate and try and free Gare and Gerald, and they make all of these arguments. And the king of the Dorig says, well, I see the force of your argument, and I'm really sorry because I didn't know this kid was Guest's kid, and this is awfully rude of me. And I have sworn to preserve Adara's bloodline or whatever, but we've already dedicated them to undo this, like, as sacrifices. We really can't undo that. There's nothing to be done about it. And then Mr. Claybury goes very rules lawyering.
Right. So there's a whole... It almost feels like the actual book is happening between these three men who have this shared backstory of the weird night before Guest got married when he did all his hero tasks. So Hathel, the Dory King, Guest, and Jerry as sort of Masterfield Senior, the chief farmer on the moor, the human king, the local squire.
Right, they call him a chief among the humans, which I think is, they call both him and Claybury chiefs among the humans, which again I think is really a stretch, but intentionally so.
Right, but it turns out that like all of this isn't just negotiating among these guys, and their best friends, so each of them has got a mate, like a chief bard in the case of Guest and Hathel, and his mate, the civil servant, in the case of Mr. Masterfield. And it's these guys who are doing the negotiating and the arguing. And what becomes increasingly clear to Gare as he watches this plot that he is not really part of is that the others are angling to make Hathil volunteer to take the curse upon himself.
Yes.
And of course, this is what curses do, right? This is absolutely true to the sources. You swear an awful curse that will destroy everything and everyone, eventually it will rebound on the caster. That the curse which Hathil's brother swore as he died will eventually come back to haunt Hathil, and because Hathil is king, it will destroy his whole people, and this is the ultimate culmination of tragedy, and you can see that tragedy coming. And Gare is watching Hathil, and he has this sympathy for him, and actually I found myself thinking of Dog's Body, where Sirius, in the final hunt, is chasing this prey, which is the dark power under the earth, the power of the moon, maybe? This dark power of death, and he is chasing this prey, and he is desperate to catch it and destroy it, and at the same time desperately hoping it will get away. And when he finally catches it, he is both the happiest he has ever been and the most heartbroken he's ever been.
Yes.
And this idea of sympathy for the hunted comes back here in Gare and is revealed to be a heroic trait in him because he sees what's being done to Hathil, and he stands up and said, listen, if somebody needs to die to appease the curse, take me. And that's another actually willing sacrifice. And that appeases another power. It appeases the new power, the power of the sun. The middle power, the power of the sun. And again, it's suggested that because Gare is of his people, he has this kind of intuitive, instinctive understanding, this emotional connection to what really needs to be done. So just as Hafni handed himself over to die, then it's Gare who hands himself over to die.
Yeah, and what Adara says about this, when they're again sort of negotiating what sacrifices are needed, the middle power lies behind the sun, and so it is the power I understand best. It is a fierce power of light and life and the present time, and that is the power which asks most for blood, as all living things need to feed, but it is not unappeasable. It is life, and I do not think it asks for death.
Right, and it's actually just Gare's volunteering of his life that's enough. He doesn't actually have to die. Whereas I think Hafni did have to risk certain death and came very close to it. At one point, Auburn's son, I think, nearly stabs him.
Yeah.
And says, I can't believe we haven't quoted this, by the way, the sort of the key line of Auburn and his family is, the only good Dorig is a dead Dorig. Which obviously is echoing the famous line from, who was it who said it? It's an American one. You know all American things, right?
Oh, some American things. And Diana Wynne Jones did also know some American things because she evokes, I mean, the term that she uses is Red Indian, where this book is written in the 70s. But she's talking, when she has Gerald thinking about how people are going to come in and take over if they reveal Gare and guess in the existence of these people to giants, humans at large, they're immediately going to come in and, people are going to come in, take over them more and turn them into a spectacle. And that's the example that he goes to is the treatment of Native Americans in the United States. And meanwhile, the linemen, Gare's people, are using the only good Dorig is a dead Dorig, which is again a direct reference to the treatment of the Native Americans in the United States. So it's refracted on itself. It's clearly something that she is thinking about.
Right. As I said, there's clearly like a strand of post-colonial race relations in this book of the treatment of indigenous peoples, of who was here first.
Right, in a very 70s way of, if we all see each other as people, we can all learn to get along. She's not thinking about...
Also in a children's book way.
Right, and she's not thinking about justice. I mean, well, maybe she is thinking about justice, but she's thinking about justice as revenge, as the problem of revenge. She's not thinking about restorative justice or anything like that that one might maybe wish her to take a step further and think about.
Yeah, it's one of the ways in which I think the book bites off more than it can chew thematically.
Yeah.
But to come back to this final sequence, right, we've appeased two powers through Hafni's and Gare's sacrifices, and you'd be reading this and you think, well, right, we've got a trio of three boys, two of them have taken the final step and broken the curse, so you're up, Gerald. That is not what happens.
Yeah, Gerald is irrelevant.
Nothing to do with any of this. So the final power that needs to be appeased is the new power, the power of Earth, the power associated with the giants. And this, I read this and I went to you and I was like, so I think this is Diana Wynne Jones's most explicitly Christian book.
Uh-huh.
And
I hadn't read it yet. So I was like, what is this, an Aslan?
Your reaction was very funny. So let me explain what I mean. So this is the point where they're trying to decide what the new power means, and the Dory said, listen, somebody has got to be human sacrifice today. There is something here that needs life. And the person who steps up to explain what the new power really wants is Mr. Claybury, the civil servant.
The civil servant.
Like, I think possibly the least likely final heroic figure. So let me see. Now, as to the new power, this is Adara speaking, the new power which lies behind the earth, that is the most mysterious. I know it is the power of birth, growth, and future time, and I think the nature of the sacrifice it asks might be different from the others. New things spring from the decay of life, the chief Doric songman said. It asks life. Allow me, dear lady, said Mr. Claybury, putting his glasses on again, and seeming rather happier. As a representative of the people of Earth, you could hear him want to say the government there.
Oh, absolutely.
I think I understand this so-called new power a little. Believe me, your majesty, it may be a very vigorous power, but it is also a gentler one than you might think. It could well ask for life renewed, as it were. And you can see Mr. Claybury sort of hinting, and at this point, Hathel, exasperated, just losing, go, this is stupid! I am not human sacrificing anyone!
Right.
I'm done. And that moment, when he rejects the curse, when he rejects death, when he says, I personally am stepping back from this situation, from this requirement of destiny, from this prophecy, I personally am rejecting the power of death and choosing life today, and through that, everyone can be saved.
Yep.
And I went, wait a minute, I know this story.
Yeah, and I hadn't read it yet at the time, so I was like, what, is this like an Aslan on the stone table thing? Like, are we harkening back to Narnia? You're like, no, that's not what we're doing.
No, but I do think that the myth that Diana Wynne Jones is drawing on here, this like thing she does in every book, I think, that at the end of the story, someone says, I know this story and I know how to solve this problem.
Yes.
If you know the myth, you can solve the problem. But the myth that we're drawing on here, the myth that the giants understand instinctively, intuitively, while the other peoples do not, the myth which breaks the whole thing open and reveals that everything is fine in the end, I think it's Christianity. I think that's how we're meant to read that.
Yeah.
I can't see it any other way.
I think you're 100% right. And, you know, we had this sort of conversation about whether she's doing this because she really believes in the supremacy of Christianity, which I don't think is true. I don't think she's trying to use this story to explain something about Christianity.
I think she's just... I've just been rereading C.S. Lewis, I've been rereading Narnia, and when you read Lewis, you know that he is a Christian and he thinks you should be too.
Right.
This is not preachy, this is using the myth.
Right, this is a story like all the other stories that she uses. And we're not meant to come out of this thinking the giants are right, or that you're supposed to go round to their way of thinking. There's actually a really interesting beat very early on when Gare is talking to Jest about the giants, and Jest says, don't let the giants find you. If they find a child, they will take that child away because they seem to think that they can bring them up better.
Right.
Which is a fear and a horror.
Again. But this actually is this idea of changelings, right? But turned backwards. So it's fairies will steal your children away. It's the humans will steal your children away and send them to school.
Right, which is also a concern if we're talking about indigenous peoples and we're talking about colonization.
Right, but it's never dug into, never gone into any...
So we're not, it's not expected that everyone in this book is going to go around suddenly starting, thinking about the new power all the time. But it's a way out in a very, in a way that's, I think, kind of a cheat, not fully satisfying because it happens so quickly.
And it's also just like this random civil servant who does it. It doesn't have it doesn't have the mythic weight that you want it to have.
Right, and you want it to have, because again, we're set up, at the beginning of the book we have Adara. Adara swears to undo the curse. And I am going to backtrack a little bit, I think, and use this as a way to talk about one of the other things I've wanted to talk about, which is the women in this story, because there are quite a lot of them. There's Adara, who is a fairly atypical mother for a Diana Wynne Jones book. She's a good mother.
Well, that is atypical.
And she's wise. She's notoriously wise. And she is set up as the person who's going to undo the curse. She doesn't. She gets down there and she explains some things, and then Mr. Claybury comes in and figures out the end.
The curse, which is, or Hathill undoes the curse on Mr. Claybury's advice.
Right. And we also have, there's a trio of girls. There's Aina, who is constantly worried about, predicting or unpredicting the right thing. That, again, doesn't really happen. We're not relying on Aina's predictions in the end of the book, or on Aina to know.
I mean, it does sort of govern the midpoint. There is a point at which the Dorrig invade Garholt, Gare's mound, and it turns out that nobody asked Aina the right questions, and she's heartbroken about this. But that's it. We've got no further development of that.
And there's Brenda, who is Gerald's, frenemy from down the road, who is one of the most glaring examples of Diana Wynne Jones' fat phobia. The descriptions of her are really awful, even though she's a heroic character. And one of the other things that sort of brings around the end of the book is there's also Hala, who's Hafni's sister, who is beautiful and stupid. It's very, very funny.
I gotta say, the sequence where Brenda sees Hala for the first time.
Oh my god. Every time Brenda sees a girl of one of the other species, the first thing she says is,
like, you're gorgeous,
you're so beautiful.
And I think it's probably meant to be read as envy, but to me it just reads gay.
It was incredibly gay. Hala, it's so funny, Hala unhoods and is revealed as beautiful, the first time they're seeing an unhooded Dorrig. And it's Aina and Brenda who are like, oh my god, she's so hot. And Gare's like, I notice Aina and Brenda thinking that she's hot. To me, it does nothing.
No, because Gare is interested in dark, gloomy boys who think
exactly. But so it's Hala who brings Hafni to Brenda, and Brenda brings him to Adara. And this sort of exchange of, moving Hafni around and figuring out what's going on and passing the sacrifice along is what enables the finale. And the other thing that enables the finale, again, in this sort of weak racism way, is it's Gare looking at the trio of Aina and Brenda and Hala all talking to each other and arguing with each other, but also thinking the other is hot. And is like, oh, you're all three alike. You're all three people. I recognize what a bossy older sister or younger sister or bossy sister is like, and you're the same. So there's this really interesting mirrored connection between these three girls who are also clearly, in the background of having these moments of looking at each other and feeling connection the same way that Gare and Gerald look at each other and feel connection. That's never dug into because we're never in any of their heads. We're briefly in
because they can't be protagonists because it's 1970s Diana Wynne Jones and she doesn't write female protagonists. And I do actually want to pick up, like, one thing I've really noticed reading that horrible description of Brenda when she first appears as the giantess, and what Gare focuses on is she's so fat and so disgusting, and that I've disgust and the fatness are closely connected. It's really nasty stuff. This is also more or less how Jones writes about her own body as a teenager in her essays, about being too big, too large, taking up too much space, being too loud. And it also sort of ties into how she writes about how she couldn't write female protagonists to begin with. She says, the identification was too close. I kept getting caught up in the tactile sensations of being a girl, which meant you towered over boys the same age, were forced to wear your hair so that it got in the way, and your chest flopped embarrassingly. I knew that in order to see my hero as a real person, I had to be slightly more distant than that. I think, actually, it's the first time I felt any sympathy for the way she writes about teenage girls in these early books. It's like, oh, you're not having a good time, are you?
No.
And in fact, so much of this these early works are about longing to belong in masculinity, or at least to get the hell out of femininity.
Yeah, even in Dog's Body, I think, Dog's Body is about being in the wrong body. It's about the limitations of your body and how it prevents you from the heroic action you want to take.
Yeah, I didn't think I would find myself arguing Diana Wynne Jones. Subtextual trans themes? But
there's a little bit of that there, or at least, discomfort with the body she's in. I think it's really palpable. And she sort of, she's projecting that onto largeness. And the happy ending for Brenda is Brenda asks Aina, will I be thin someday? And Aina says yes. And Brenda's overjoyed. And congratulations, Brenda's got her happy ending. Because we're not digging into the consciousness of any of these women yet. But it is, I think, the first time that she's writing women interacting with each other meaningfully. And we're going to get that a little more and more, I think, as, from this point on. Like, I think this does mark a little bit of a turning point in that she's starting to think about it, even though she can't write about it directly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The other thing I wanted to pick up, actually, just before we finish, going back to Christianity as a useful myth.
Yeah.
And this again is from Reflections. Jones was sort of thinking about how Christianity affects this idea of having a hero and a myth hero. And she argues that a mythical hero, a fantastic hero, as one of their qualities, has a special connection with God or with the gods. They're chosen by the gods, guided by the gods. And, I think she's got a point. And she says, a medievalist I consulted about this opined that Christianity had substantially affected the heroic ideal, especially where women were concerned, by introducing ideas of patience and endurance and the solitary personal struggle against one's own fleshly instincts.
Yeah.
She puts this forward and then rejects it straight away and says, listen, Penelope predates that. That's in the Odyssey. Penelope is patient, endurance, struggles. Endurance? That's a word. I made it a word. But then she puts forward her own argument. I began to see just what Christianity had really added to the heroic tradition. It had reinforced the high ideal, for God is love, but heroes have always had that, even if they do not know it when they begin. But more importantly, Christianity had modified the tradition that a hero is guided by a god or gods, for God watches over everyone. I now knew that every ordinary man or woman could be a hero.
Yeah.
And one thing that's hit thematically in this book over and over again is Gare's terror of being ordinary, that
yes,
he can't be a hero, and his first believing that his father is a hero, and then discovering that his father is ordinary too, that he cheated and being betrayed by it. So this idea of the connection between being an ordinary person and being a hero comes back over and over again in this book where the solving myth is Christianity. And there is a crunch here that Jones is thinking about the possibility of an ordinary hero and how that connects to a mythic world, a divine world.
Right, I think so. So it's the recognition. So at first it's a betrayal, the recognition that his father is ordinary. And then at the end, it's the thing that connects them. It's that, it is heroic to go and make connections with these other three species.
In the most ordinary way possible, to get drunk and laugh together. That is a heroic connection. And in fact, that's even hinted at when George is first telling the story of that drunken bachelor night. The curse stops working for a little bit.
Yeah, they're able to reconnect again.
They can feel the evil kind of backing off from this memory of drunken laughter together because, in fact, masculine bonding and belonging in masculinity is from evil. I can't wow. Okay.
It's so funny. It is. It's so what it is almost like I've been meaning to say that it is. When I read 8 Days of Luke, I was like, oh, this book is singular in the way it in the way it describes masculine friendship. It's not. This Power of 3 is doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But what it's backed away from is 8 Days of Luke is haunted by this idea that those who the gods love die young, and here she's and Dogbody I think is haunted by it too. But this book, she's able to, nobody's dying young. There's no hint that anybody's going to die young. There's no hint that anybody's particularly beloved by the gods. We've moved away from this idea of the hero who is loved by the gods probably for tragic ends, towards this idea that, the everyday hero, the ordinary person that the gods will recognize, that divinity, Christianity will recognize for their ordinary actions.
Right. So you can see her sort of working through, flipping around the different ideas she's had about the connections between myth time and story time. And in here, because of course Gare is a fairy, an elf. His world is myth time to us, the humans, but the humans are myth time back to him. And that sort of forced perspective, that point of view control, organizes the whole book.
And it is, I think, one of the things that makes the book really interesting, and also why it feels like it doesn't work, because you have this whole force of myth time, of Gare's myth time, that's building up for those first 90 pages, as we've said. And then the human alter myth time comes in and just changes the way the entire story works, which is cool. I think it's a cool structural conceit, but it also feels like the whole book is full of potential energy that doesn't really have anywhere to go and gets sort of dissolved into things that feel a little bit like platitudes. We're all people, really.
Yeah, there's that very pat resolution, and meanwhile, the great and mighty curses you get in the first chapter kind of work off screen or in a sort of half-assed way, so you never feel the real force of them. And at the end, there are none of Auburn's people left alive on the moor because they leave.
Right, they moved away. Thank God, we're never going to have to talk to our awful aunt again.
Yeah, that's it? That's it? I think possibly we should call it there because we are running over.
Yes. Thank you guys again for listening to another episode. Next week we'll be talking about Charmed Life, which I think picks up again on some of these themes in really interesting ways.
Our first Crestomancy, and this was my first Diana Wynne Jones. I am really looking forward to talking about it.
I'm really excited for it. So you can, again, thanks for listening. You can find us anywhere you find podcasts. And if you have questions or things you want us to talk about, you can email us at 8daysofdiana@gmail.com. Thanks and see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.